Dead wrong. HIV/AIDS testing and diagnosis. Lies that have been killing for decades. The World Health Organization suggests not retesting if you feel you have received a false positive diagnosis of HIV. They also suggest a person who may not be infected with HIV should continue antiretroviral medications. PrEP therapy is the same concept without a positive HIV diagnosis, which is often prescribed to individuals with confirmed false positive HIV tests. False positives are much more prevalent than the misleading scientific information would suggest from their controlled studies. World Health Organization, HIV/AIDS, Quality of HIV Testing and Prevention of Misdiagnosis, Questions and Answers, from August 29, 2017. What should be done if a person on antiretroviral therapy is suspected to have been misdiagnosed with HIV? WHO recommends that people with HIV who are on antiretroviral therapy should not be retested for HIV due to the risk of false negative results. People diagnosed with HIV who are on antiretroviral therapy but suspected of misdiagnosis should not have their antiretroviral therapy discontinued to retest and confirm misdiagnosis. Self-testing using blood-based and oral fluid tests is not recommended for people on antiretroviral therapy. Occasionally, a person may have been started on antiretroviral therapy on the basis of a single reactive HIV test result. In such cases, there is a small chance that this single result was a false reactive result. These cases should be considered on an individual basis by review of the person's clinical records and medical history, exposure risk and partner's HIV status if this is known, and an assessment on how to proceed made by their clinician. It is important, therefore, that all people testing for HIV are informed that if they are taking antiretroviral therapy, that they should not test again. If they have concerns about the possibility of being misdiagnosed, they should discuss their concerns with their clinician. WHO is working to assess new evidence on providing additional guidance on retesting people using PrEP and possible testing strategies or approaches for testing people on antiretroviral therapy, and further guidance will follow. HIV diagnoses are given based on constantly changing algorithms because there are no tests for the HIV virus. Even now, in 2019, there has never been a test to detect HIV or infection caused by HIV. Below, you will see the CDC's guidance from May of 2018 for clinicians who are testing for HIV. It shows that they should expect that in areas with a lower prevalence of already diagnosed HIV infection, they will find a higher amount of false positive tests, whereas in areas that are more prevalent for already diagnosed HIV infection, they will find less false positives based on the area. A few things known to cause false positive or false reactive rapid tests, ELISA, or Western blot tests. Antibodies to HLA antigens, multiple blood transfusions, influenza vaccine, open air contamination of specimens, freezing and thawing of specimen, naturally occurring antibodies, heating of specimen, pregnancy. HIV testing is opt-out for pregnant women, meaning it is done automatically unless otherwise requested by the patient. Influenza, Epstein-Barr, human herpes virus 4, HHV4, which is also mononucleosis, Mycobacterium avium, systemic lupus erythematosus, renal failure, kidney failure, herpes simplex 1 and 2, upper respiratory infection, receiving or being exposed to viral vaccines or someone who has received a vaccine, hemodialysis, malaria, hepatitis A and B, lymphoma, tests kept outside temperature range. If you look any of this up, you will see the emphasis on false negatives before false positives. Kary Mullis, a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, said this: "It's not even probable, let alone scientifically proven, that HIV causes AIDS. If there is evidence that HIV causes AIDS, there should be scientific documents which either singly or collectively demonstrate that fact, at least with a high probability. There are no such documents."
The first time I really questioned it, I was working on a project where we were measuring HIV in people's blood at this place called Specialty Laboratories in Santa Monica. I was just a consultant there. I came in about 3 days a month. We needed to re-up our grant from the NIH to work on that, and I had to write it. And so the first line of that was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I wrote that, and then I said, well, I need a paper, some kind of scientific paper, to reference that statement, because when you make a statement like that, that's like a fact. You need to say, here's how come I know that. And you say, here's a paper by somebody that describes why that statement is true. Let me think about, what is that paper? Who do I go to for that? And I looked around, I asked a couple of virologists at that company, and they said, no, you don't have to reference. I said, I have to reference that because I don't know I don't know where that came from. How do I know that? And it turned out that nobody knew it. There wasn't a scientific reference, like a paper that somebody had submitted with like experimental data in it and like logical discussion and said, here's how come we know that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. There was nothing out there like that. Nothing. By the time I met Luc Montagnier, I had met a lot of AIDS researchers at meetings, and I had always gone up to them. If they talked like they knew about HIV and AIDS, I always went up to them afterwards and I said, where can I find a scientific reference that I can use for my, remember I said I had a sentence there, it said HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and I needed to have that backed up by something before I could write it and submit it. And I went around, I asked a whole lot of people. I said, well, the people, you know, I can't find it. At first I looked for it, you know, just in like computer searching kind of stuff like that. But then I said, there's got to be somebody that knows this. So you go to experts and ask them. And so I asked all these people one after the other, and none of them had it. None of them. And I was getting really freaked about that. That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham. It's ridiculous. But then finally Montagnier came to there was a special little seminar down in San Diego where an old friend of Robert Gallo's, Flossie Wong-Stahl, was opening up a Department of AIDS Research down in San Diego. They had lots of money involved, federal money, and they had Montagnier come there and give a talk. And after that, they had a little wine and cheese thing, and I went over to Montagnier afterwards, and I said, Dr. Montagnier, I can't find a reference, like I can't find a reference to go with the statement HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. I'm sure you can help me. And he knew that he probably should be able to help me, and he said, well, why don't you quote this new work, and by new he meant like something that came out this year, right? This new work about a virus that can kill monkeys, or I think it was not monkeys, it was like something related to monkeys, some kind of a baby, a little ape. And I had read that and I said, that didn't, it was like supposedly going to be a model system for studying AIDS, that somebody had figured out some kind of retrovirus that passing it back and forth between various mammals, they could finally put it into chimpanzees and kill them. And it killed them in about a week, and it didn't kill them in any, there was nothing like AIDS there, you know. It doesn't kill you in a week. It was just totally ridiculous. None of the symptoms were the same. And I said, well, you know, I read that paper, and I didn't see any connection between that and AIDS, and I don't think that would be a real, I wouldn't want to use that as a reference. Oh, no, before he told me about that paper, he said, why don't you use the NIH, like the CDC report? And I said, well, I looked at that, and that was not a scientific paper. And then he said, what about this other thing, this like paper that had just come out about a month before, and a lot of fanfare associated with that paper, but it was total crap. It was like, yeah, if you got $2 million, you can figure out how to kill a primate with a retrovirus. So what? Doesn't have anything to do with AIDS. It didn't look like AIDS, it didn't smell like AIDS, it wasn't AIDS. It was just like, got a retrovirus that can kill a chimpanzee, so what?
Kary Mullis invented the PCR, polymerase chain reaction test, that is said to confirm diagnosis of HIV and test for viral load. The problem is, he made it clear that his invention can't be used to measure viral load of any virus, because it makes more of it.
When we look at this pandemic, it's been driven by testing. In many ways, it's been referred to as a testdemic. Anytime you raise the amount of testing you do, you also raise the amount of infections you're going to find. That's just an obvious mathematical scenario. Behind this pandemic is the PCR test we've all heard about, and that was designed by a scientist named Kary Mullis. He actually won the Nobel Prize for designing PCR testing.
You're familiar with the testing. That's the nasal swab. They take this big 4 to 6 inch swab. They jam it down your nose. What seems like, takes an hour to do the swabbing. They pull out some samples of your DNA. They put it on a little dish. We send it to the lab. The lab then takes that, and what they do is they They look at this under a really specific type of a device, this machine, and they amplify your DNA. They actually take your own DNA and they magnify it. They blow it up, 2 times, 4 times, 6 times, again and again and again. And every time they magnify it and amplify the cycle, you can see more and more stuff that's going on in your own DNA and in that tissue sample. Well, we know that if you blow it up big enough, at least according to PhD Nobel Prize winning scientist Kary Mullis, who's the doctor that created the PCR test, if you blow that PCR sample size up big enough, you can see almost anything on any body.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful.
Now, in his own words, the PCR test should never be used to diagnose disease. Let me repeat that. The man who created the PCR test said this test should never be used to diagnose disease. It is simply a tool to find if there's even a fragment of an illness inside of somebody. It came about when they were looking for AIDS, and very difficult to find viruses that you wouldn't, as he said.
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there on the top are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on at the bottom. Those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way. They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to. And they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera. Okay, who do we trust? Fauci? Fauci doesn't know enough to, if Fauci wants to get on television with somebody who knows a little bit about this stuff and debate him, he could easily do it because he's been asked.
What is now sort of evolving into a bit of a standard that if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. So that if somebody, and we have patients, and it's very frustrating for the patients as well as for the physicians. Somebody comes in and they repeat their PCR and it's like 37 cycle threshold. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
What about the etiology of AIDS? I've been alluding throughout this entire discussion to this virus that causes AIDS. What about this virus? What is it? I'm sure you've heard about it in the paper. We call it the human T-cell leukemia lymphoma virus, or HTLV-3. And the reason we call it that was that a few years ago, Bob Gallo from the Cancer Institute here at the NIH had discovered that a virus, a retrovirus as we call it, and that's what it is, a retrovirus, because it has a particular type of an enzyme in it which gives you a reversal of the usual genetic process of propagating itself, was causing, this HTLV-1 was causing adult T-cell lymphomas and leukemias that were endemic in Japan, in the Caribbean, and in certain southeastern states of the United States. In fact, a variant of this HTLV-1, which we've been calling HTLV-3, is in fact the etiologic agent of AIDS.
You can't expect the sheep to really respect the best and the brightest. They don't know the difference, really. I mean, I like humans, don't get me wrong, but basically the vast majority of them do not possess the ability to judge who is and who isn't a really good scientist. I mean, that's a problem. That's a main problem, actually, with science, I'd say, in this century, because science is being judged by people, and funding is being done by people who don't understand it.
In fact, the New York Times even put out a story, and I'm going to quote a little bit of what they said. There's glitches in the PCR test. 90% of the tests were not indicative of the active illness.
I believe it was 2006 or 7 at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. It was thought that there was an outbreak of whooping cough, and the staff there used the PCR technology, because again, I don't want to refer to it as a test, to diagnose whooping cough, and it had a 0% efficacy rate. And that, I did not misspeak. It was actually 0%. And believe it or not, the New York Times covered that story and didn't take it down. Last I checked, it was still there. So the one time it was used in some medical setting, it had a 0% efficacy rate.